What's up, world? It's Willy What If here with another upload for you. This is part 14 of What If Deku Gave Up on Being a Hero. Unfortunately, we're nearing the end of this series, but I'll work hard to find more just as good as this one. Make sure to check out the original story in the description, leave lots of laugh and comments, and maybe they'll write more. For now, enjoy this latest part. Guaranteed to not have any repeating chapters. Part 14. Pain was never anything Izuku shied away from, it had always been a facet of his life. Be it the danger of school, the grinding monotony of his job, the threat involved with his hobby as a sidekick, or the myriad of pains, both pleasant and otherwise, his relationship with Himiko brought. That was more than manageable, but the awkward feeling of walking back into the Sugarman agency after getting a call from Shoto. He had been AWOL for days since the reunion, and the time in between wasn't a calm event in the slightest. Things had been ramping up in his life, and even with everything that made him stash Himiko away at his home dying down, he couldn't shake the sinking feeling as he walked inside. The door opened easy enough and everything was like it was the last time he was here, but it still felt off being here. A stamp of boots came from ahead of the corner as he entered the main area where the training equipment and boxing ring was stored, and seconds later Shoto was standing in his usual civilian attire of jeans, black boots, and a white t-shirt. The sugar hero had a reserved, even embarrassed expression as he regarded his sidekick with an uneasy smile. "Hey Izuku, haven't seen you in a bit." The quirkless man lifted up his phone from his pocket and raised it up like a ticket while remaining the most professionally neutral he could. "You sent me a text saying you needed to speak with me. Is there something going on?" Shoto lessened his smile and inhaled through his teeth as he rubbed the back of his neck. His eyes were cast to the ground for a moment before focusing on the green-eat's shoulder. "Yeah, about that, I wanna apologize for that shitshow you walked into at the reunion. None of us intended for it to go that way, and we get why you freaked out. A hero shouldn't talk like we did, and I hope you would still consider working with me despite the ugliness I went along with." Izuku shrugged as he put his phone away, looking every bit like the stoic office worker he was molded into. "As long as I'm not part of any crime, then I don't see a reason not to. And for my own part, I owe you an apology for acting so unprofessional and ditching last week. Unfortunately, all this coincided with some personal trouble for me, but that's no excuse." The smile returned with relief shining in Soto's eyes as he regained his usual vigor. "Hey, it's completely fine. Given everything, it's more than forgivable. I'm just glad you're still up to help." Izuku reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a business card as he regarded the hero. "I do owe you quite a lot, just to keep that in mind. However, I'd like to ask a favor if it isn't too inappropriate. A coworker of mine has recently been trying to break into the industry, and I can vouch for personal character, so if you know anyone in need of a sidekick, would you mind passing his information along?" Shoto studied the card with a critical eye before regarding his sidekick in the same way. "I'll see what I can do, but do you actually trust this guy? I know I'm paranoid here, but there's been a history of villains infiltrating the ranks before." A hand was raised in dismissal by the desk jockey. "I assure you that to my knowledge he is as straight-edged as can be. Now with that out of the way, would you mind if I took a crack at our overdraft?" Walking to his desk in the back room, Izuku began to look over the documents that had accumulated in his absence. As he predicted, it was a little more than manageable if he had a whole day to contend with the work, let alone with it being Tuesday and him having only recently gotten off his day job. Still, he set an alarm for 7 p.m. on his phone and dove in, completing forums the best he could for what felt like hours. Then there came a hand on his shoulder and he looked up to see Shoto standing over him with a mug of hot chocolate. "I think you've done enough for today. You still have that 9 to 5 to worry about, and I don't want you staying up for my sake." Izuku glared with a professional disdain at the suggestion, but gazing at the clock and his own fatigue, he was forced to agree. Taking the cup, he sighed and enjoyed the sweet. "I did the best I could with what time I had. But that aside, how are you holding up in light of recent events?" The Sugar Rush user paused as he took his own mug from his desk and sipped the brew. "Honestly, I'm fine, but I keep having nightmares after being reminded about that bitch. It's just something I've learned to deal with." Izuku raised a quizzical eyebrow at his employer. "Forgive my asking, but have you ever met this TOGA woman?" Shoto grimaced suddenly and shivered. "Thankfully no, I haven't. In the grand scheme of my classmates, I was always outshined even back then. I doubt she's even aware I existed, since I tended to blend into the background when compared to Bakugo or Todoroki or the others." I almost fought her back during the war because I literally walked into her on a rampage, but by some miracle she didn't notice me. Izuku pursed his lips as a morbid curiosity started to bloom in his head. Can I ask what that was like? The fighter shrugged his shoulders and sipped his cocoa, looking uncomfortably unfazed by whatever he was remembering. It was single-handedly the most horrifying experience of my life, and I'm including having to fight for my life during the USJ attack and the majority of the war. She walked into this group of heroes who were just on rescue duty with her body looking like some hero she killed, and there was a pause as fear flashed in his eyes and he gripped the mug in a knuckle-whitening hold. They were all dead before they even knew what was going on. She just walked up to them without a word when they thought it was their friend who came to help. The first went down with a slash to the neck and she just kept going. Left and right without a single pause until they were dead and the stuff that made her look like the guy was sloshing off. I saw the look in her eyes, and it was only because I was in an alley that she didn't see me, because if I had taken another step a second before, I would have joined those poor fuckers on the ground. He inhaled as he curled his free hand and held it until a few heartbeats passed. Another sip of chocolate was had and he returned to a somewhat normal personage. So yeah, definitely not my favorite person. Though I really doubt anyone could tolerate that psycho. Izuku took this all in and felt an odd mixture of concern, as well as admiration. You mean to tell me she managed to take down multiple heroes with just a knife and a trick? How the hell did anyone catch her if that was the case? Shoto had a sort of fatalistic dread in his tone that was completely at odds with his usual personality. One born of a deep trauma. We didn't. She turned herself in, and that's why she was able to go free. If she hadn't had done that, then she'd probably still be wanted and the last monster still prowling around taking lives, assuming she isn't doing that as we speak. He looked at the shorter man with unreadable eyes as the cup in his hand turned. But, lately I've been rather curious about your girlfriend. Because when I looked up the word blood shield in the quirk registry, nothing came up. Now I'm not assuming you lied, and I'm doing my best to consider that it was a simple mistake. I'd still like an explanation. As a matter of fact, why haven't any of us met this woman? You've been a part of our cliché for over a year and she may as well be a ghost. Panic nested in Izuku's chest, yet his mask never fell. He was every bit the calm, mundane drone he pretended to be. Finishing up the last of his drink and setting the cup to the side, he regarded his boss casually. She's a very private person, as you can guess. With her quirk, I assume it was just a name she slapped on herself rather than the government. Although, I can see where you're going with this, and I assure you I am not having relations with the last member of the PLF. Her quirk allows for excess blood to be spread through her pores and hardened like a shell that falls off as a grey goo, and yes, it's as disturbing as you can imagine when we're in the sack. The answer didn't seem to ease Shoto, but neither did he seem hostile or angry. Instead, he simply stood up from his chair and walked to his filing cabinet. Without a word, he pulled out a manila folder that was as thick as his hand and held it up with an almost palpable disgust before turning back to his employee. I believe you, but just to ease my anxiety. Again he stared at the folder in his hand like it was a rotting piece of filth before moving to Izuku's desk and placing it in front of him. Hesitation lingered on his face until he sighed and continued. I'd prefer it if you looked at that villain's record in full. He pressed a hand down on the cover and leaned in before Izuku could reach out to open it. But just to warn you, this stuff is disturbing. Shoto pulled away from the desk and allowed him to handle the folder. Opening it, Izuku could see plain as day it was Himiko's file with all the things he'd seen beforehand. However, after the first page within the thick collection of papers, things began to get more detailed. There was a paper on her neuroses, habits, and personality. That in turn led to a paper on her psychology in relation to her quirk, which then transferred to one in regards to her family history and allegations of abuse and neglect raised against her parents. Piece after piece it painted a picture of who Himiko was, most of which he knew somewhat superficially, others he didn't. Like one bit of detail from her mother that she was the product of infidelity from her father, or a claim from a middle school teacher that she would drink lamb's blood stored in the science labs. Then there were 3 paragraphs about how she was taken to a now debunked quirk therapy center run by a Dr. Uiko, which had direct ties to various criminal organizations. History of medication, psyche ward internment, a few photos, hand-drawn pictures that depicted what was clearly a child's depiction of a domestic dispute, and various pictures of bleeding birds. All in all, it was fairly standard. However, things would take a drastic turn when he turned the page and saw a picture of a young man who bared a shockingly similar appearance to himself if he was a teenager again. The youth had stitches all over his torso from what were clearly deep slashes with a knife, and from the angle it was impossible for any to be self-inflicted. Reading below the picture, he saw the man's name was Saito Hazmai and he was only 15 at the time of being hospitalized. The information then went on to elaborate on how he was approached by Himiko, who to his testimony was blushing and had a drunken look to her eyes at the time and professed her love to him, which caused him to back away nervously. Tears began leaking from her eyes while a perverse smile formed on her face as she proceeded to take out a box cutter she concealed in her pocket and start attacking him. When he was incapacitated, a straw was placed inside the largest cut on his arm and she began to drink from it. Turning the page, he found another document over a young man named Kenichi Soma who looked nearly identical to him that was found mutilated in a back alley in Honshu. There were fragments of security camera transcripts that date back from over a week before the killing, and every one shows Himiko following him from a crowd. The next showed more of the same, then the next and the next and the next, and so on were all alike. Young men and women who bore a striking resemblance to him were sliced up in varying degrees and left drained of blood. Then there was one at the end that made him pause. He stared at the paper with sweating, beady eyes and felt his gut twist and turn. A picture was in front of him that showed a woman strapped to a bed frame whose skin around her arms had been degloved right down to the bone in some places. Cuts lined her face and part of her breasts had been sliced off, while there were mouth-sized chunks of flesh torn from her torso. Yet what he saw inscribed on her chest was worse than all of the other horrors on display. On the woman's ruined chest, 2 words were etched into her flesh that made his blood run cold. Himiko's baby. The world faded away as if someone had put a blind over his eyes. His hands began to shake and every scar on his body burned with a sharp phantom pain. Silently he took a trembling hand to his chest, feeling every dash of the knife as those very words were once carved into his chest. He stared at the picture with a certain numbness to his core as if her fist was hitting there again. All the while the kinship between himself and this dead woman became more and more realized until his nerve had snapped. The paper fell from his fingers to the desk as all the strength left him. His skin turned a shrieking white with sweat dripping off his neck. His mouth was dry and his eyes far away as his mind raced to process what he saw meant. No air passed through his lips, with even his lungs ceasing to naturally work from the revelation. Then at once it did. Vomit rose from his throat as he dashed with the swiftness of a marked man from his desk to the bathroom, bashing the door open and flipping the lid open. He knelt on his knees as the bile shot through his mouth and into the water. A tremor rocked his body like a deep sickness as he continued to throw up with force until his stomach was empty. His lungs screamed for air while he gasped, his mind running faster than it ever had before. Scenarios and plots and motives played out in his head as he was forced to reanalyze every event that happened in his recent life. Every moment of kindness and warmth and love suddenly erupts into a miasma of horror and betrayal. He wanted to scream as the one thing keeping him centered was brought howling into view, and the reason she even wanted him in the first place. Every ounce of pain made upon his flesh was resurrected with each passing moment as he clutched at his head. Was she waiting to kill him? Was that why she was waiting on the bridge? Was she waiting for someone like him who was so depressed they wouldn't mind being killed? Is that what those moments were between them when her fetishes came out, him being readied for when she decided to reenact her darkest fantasies? But if that was the case, why would she even allow him to view her file, to be aware of any of this? She wasn't subtle with her past and she had protected him from herself. She even came begging for him to come back after a misunderstanding. From the start she'd been blunt and almost forthcoming with her past, even admitting that she was the last living member of the League. Yet was it all a ploy to get him to trust him? Was everything she did fake? Did she just see him as another person who was arousing to torture? Was that why he was being brought into her tastes? But if that was true, why would she have encouraged him to be a hero instead of just letting him sink more into his depression? Wouldn't that have made him far easier to isolate and control? Also, why did she allow Okuko into their relationship when the woman knew exactly what she was like? Granted, it was unlikely still is to keep herself out of Tartarus, but for that matter, why did Okuko go to Himiko and him with her sexual needs when she was almost a damn victim back in the war? She was a lot of things, but Okuko wasn't a bad person. She certainly wouldn't be in league with Himiko if she had been malicious and Himiko outright told him that she did most of what she did due to her quirk being unmanaged. It didn't make it right, but hadn't she outright told him that he wasn't a victim? That her intentions were nothing less than romantic. He had looked into her eyes at the time and knew somewhere deep in his core that she meant it. Yet cutting him up and drinking his blood was romantic to her as well. But she was legally insane at the time due to her quirk. Yet hadn't she always been there through good and bad and mundane? How many times had they lounged on the sofa together or talked about old movie trivia or discussed their dreams together? Hadn't Himiko been utterly honest with him? Why else would she push him away from claiming her with this in the back of her mind? Was she protecting him from herself for all this time? Or is he trying to find a justification for the one he loves? She had worked as a leader in the PLF for an intelligence-gathering sect of the cult, so was this all one big manipulation? Had she been rooting around his mind until he was soft enough to slaughter like so many others? Or was he doubting her despite her being the reason he was still here? He cursed and stood from the toilet, his mind still racing as he cleaned himself up and flushed the offal away. Why the hell did she have to be so damn conflicting? Why couldn't she be like any of these other villains and killers who were just out there for their own psychopathic bloodlust? Why couldn't she just be bitchy and wicked so he wouldn't have these burning feelings of passion that refused to leave despite his horror? He held his head and breathed. Today would be a long one. Stepping out of the bathroom, Izuku managed to gather himself and continue to wear his professional mask despite the torrent of disgust and fear inside him. He considered rushing out the door to confront Himiko, but he didn't know if it was to vent his disgust or consume her in this burning frenzy that still flamed under his skin. Part of him wanted to run, to flee until things made sense again, and another scream to reaffirm and enrapture her in his arms. However, he had a job to do, so he remained calm as he noticed Shoto staring at him with an unreadable expression. "I apologize, that was a bit much for me." Shoto raised an eyebrow as his eyes glanced with an almost mirthful light. "Bit ironic given what you say about your sex life, wouldn't you think?" Izuku raised a dignified hand and manufactured some indignation to shield the turmoil within him. "There's a difference between what she and I do together and..." He shivered in disgust. "That. Now do you need anything else done before I go?" The more muscled man smiled sympathetically as he went to fetch his coat. "You feel like getting a drink?" Suddenly the weight of what he learned came back like a tide and caused some of his mask to drop. "Certainly." Taking the long way to Tosh's, they walked mostly in silence while Izuku grappled with what he learned. In a way he knew it shouldn't have surprised him given everything else he learned about her. Himiko was and still is a dangerous person with a small army of mental problems that were linked to a very uncomfortable sexual taste. He knew from the start and seen how chaotic her inner life is, and not once did he waver in what he felt. He accepted all that was laid before him with her, and as much as his sanity and self-preservation protested along with his own morality, most of him still did. In sight of everything else that was spoon-fed to him about her past, it seemed like a crown jewel that only barely shined brighter than the other horrid gems around it. She had murdered over 60 people as a member of the worst villain groups in recent history and almost destroyed modern society to prop up. Well, to her testimony they never even had much of Plain in that regard, and was loosely responsible for his life, as well as everyone else who wasn't psychotically inclined, being ruined. The fact she tortured those people to death for her own sexual pleasure for rejecting her when she was clinchily insane by reason of quirk-related influence, didn't seem too much worse. Now, it was worse than all the other shit she did in his opinion, but she didn't cheat, so it wasn't a complete deal-breaker when he knew all the other horrible shit she did in her youth. Yet he thought that the part of him that was sociable, polite, and maybe even decent railed against that sense of fanatical love and devotion to someone who likely would have put him on that rack if they met when they were younger. Even as he considered that, there was a pathetic, lonely, and almost spiteful section of his brain that posed that question. Himiko had, to her own admittance, known what she did was wrong and acted due to being rejected. All those people pushed her away because they couldn't see what he saw, and she had done those deeds with the sole purpose of finding devotional love. Perhaps if they had met when they were younger and he had pulled the trigger and found a courage like her to scorn society, maybe they could have preserved each other. Maybe they could have fought in the war as spies and he could have been the outlet for all her urges and nursed her into a new world while they made a family together. Or maybe she would have strapped him to a bed frame and tortured him until he died from blood loss. Izuku despised these thoughts that made him feel so damn weak and pathetic. He was worth more than being some lunatic's torture object. Granted, he wasn't worth as much as Katsuki or Shoto or even Shoto, but he had more to offer than just suffering for someone's arousal. Hell, there were plenty of women who wanted him, and he had at least saved one life in his short time as a sidekick. Even as a teen he had some fucking worth. He had won the bronze in the state triathlon and made one of the other ostracized people in that place happier. She even liked him despite all his shortcomings, and he gained some people's respect and a good number feared him after he finally snapped at that party. It was one thing to take his own life, as nihilistic as it was, but it was another to simply give away any autonomy to someone who just wanted to see him suffer for their own amusement until he faded into death. And yet for Himiko she was nearly worth it. For all the bad stuff she did and would have likely done, or may even still do, to him, she was still breathtakingly amazing. She was beautiful in her own unique way, with a will that wouldn't break even against the whole world, and had kindness within her sickness that made most people seem hollow. She had been there for him in a way that he never had before, and what's more is that she understands his pain. Out of every other person in the world, Himiko was one of the very few who could understand his sorrow. He loved her more than anything, and she accepted it. She accepted every ounce of his demanding, consuming love and returned it in spades, even if it was flavored with blood and teeth and eyes so alluring that they pierced his very soul. Yet was she truly worth all this atrocity? Was he really going to just keep leaping headfirst into her love when ending up as those in the picture was a possibility? Wouldn't it be better if he ignored the illogical storm in his chest and went to literally any other woman, one who wasn't even slightly capable of considering the unspeakable things she did? Yes, it wouldn't as deep emotionally, and it might even be boring having to settle for a person with no edge, but he would have to worry about being tortured to death when they copulate. Fuck, wouldn't it be better if he just went to Okako, since she was technically in their relationship? For some reason that left a sour taste in his mouth. Izuku certainly liked the woman and trusted her enough to consider her a friend and maybe more, but it didn't feel right in his head. There was Mina, who outright said she liked him and was clearly more loose with herself than Himiko. And again it made him feel gross. He still had that frog girl, Tsuyu's number, but that was more of a less concert thing. He could even contact Oki if he could push away the shame that had been eating him for the past 6 years, assuming she hadn't already moved on with her life and forgotten him. Try as he might, every scenario his mind conjured left him feeling deeply wrong, and he wanted to curse and bark at the mere thought. While he also shamed and berated the part that honestly wanted to risk violent tutor just because the woman put up with him. Even worse was the section of his soul that wanted nothing more than to run back home and take her, to mix their blood and drown her in his love until she understood how much he worshipped and adored her despite her mistakes. Maybe he was even crazier than the murderer, since he was hardly fazed by her atrocities and earnestly wanted to just embrace her all the harder while having a mental battle over how disgusting that sickening devotion was. He wanted to loathe himself and simply walk away from such a monster, to gather the few decent pieces of his life and never look back as he found someone who wasn't a killer. But no matter how hard he analyzed the facts and weighed the potentials for it all to end in his slow death, no matter how much he pleaded with himself that there were other women he could find that wouldn't do this to people and pictured them, he simply couldn't. He just couldn't. Perhaps Himiko was getting him ready to be murdered in a spectacular way as a magnum ops of her love, and she just considered him pet to be slaughtered on her whim. She was still his. For all her insanity, Himiko was the only one to reach out and make him want to improve again after he had given up. She had been loving and kind and wise, and someone he could genuinely talk to while never once taking advantage of him despite the ease. She was his entire reason for living now, and he hated himself for it. He hated how much he wanted to wait on her hand and foot while he satisfied her every urge and desire. He hated how much pride he had that she looked at him alone out of any other man on earth. He despised how much she soothed the tempest in his soul with her touch and devoured all his worries with her strength. He wanted to rage and scream at the evidence of her slaughter of the innocent, to berate and hate her simply for being like everyone else who had seen her darkness, but it wouldn't happen no matter how much he knew it should. She was a monster, a killer, a demon, and a cause of so much suffering, with himself likely as her last mark, and yet he still wanted her in spite of everything. He still deeply loved her, and that was something he was stuck with like a terminal disease. Entering the bar, Izuku nursed his resentment of his own feelings and sat down at the counter with Shoto, ordering a whiskey glass to numb the battle inside him. The sugar hero let out a whistle at the sight of the drink, thumbing his own light beer. "Damn, you're going a bit hard with the liquor tonight. What's up?" The sidekick sipped his drink and scowled at the wall of booze ahead of him. "I don't want to talk about it." Taking the hint, Shoto shrugged and contented himself with his beer for a while until he spoke up again with a far more casual tone. "You know, I've known you for over a year now, and I still don't know what your deal is." Izuku looked up with a slight glare as the drink started taking hold ever so weakly. My deal? The hero took another swig. Yeah, your deal for being the way you are. From all I've seen, you're a genuinely decent person who wants to help others, because otherwise you would have just gone with Katsuki or Mina for better benefits. But at the same time, you're a freaky guy with a lot of anger behind your eyes who's involved with a woman that I wouldn't be surprised if she was a murderer. Usually with people in this business you can figure them out in a month because of how shit the work is for most of us rank and file boot stompers, unless they win the genetic lottery and do have god-tier quirk, and even then you can tell why they're here and what they are. You on the other hand aren't so clear. Anger bubbled, edged on by the alcohol that lowered his usual professionalism as he brought the whiskey to his lips. You wanna know why I'm here doing the little bit of shit I can do? It's because I want to prove a point to myself that I'm not completely useless and maybe be there for anyone who doesn't have anyone on their side. Yeah, we don't do much, you and I, but it still does something even if we're just replaceable cogs in another machine, and maybe that can make the world a little better before we're dead. The lash in his eyes softened when he regarded his employer, turning to the front wall and staring ahead as he picked at his vice. It made him feel less caged for once, and so he continued to speak almost absent-mindedly. I thought about that a lot as a kid, saving the day and making a positive impact on someone. Even when I was diagnosed as quirkless, I always had the daydream of being a hero and being like All Might. But after a while I realized that I couldn't match up to my dreams, that I wasn't special enough to shake the ground like him or Katsuki, and the world kept beating me down. He sipped again, not really caring if anyone was listening or not at this point. Being quirkless isn't the worst affliction in the world. I still had all my limbs and my mind, and I could blend in unlike mutants who always had it worse than me. The usual thing I got was pity. Hell, being quirkless is what made my scholarship get booted up. But you look around at all these people, at everyone around you who can shape the world in a way you never can, and you start to see the pity for what it is. That's when I got resentful and bitter about things, about how I could never measure up to most people due to a screw-up in my DNA. Izuku brought his eyes back to his employer, who was listening with relaxed attention as he worked on his second bottle. Briefly he hesitated, ordering a second glass to buy seconds before he asked what was on his mind. Have you ever considered being a villain? To go against society and live any way you want to? A short, blunt laugh came from the hero as regarded his sidekick. Pal, if you thought villainy would be any better than the current side of the law you're on, then you're delusional. Look, I get it. I really do. Envy is a natural thing, and when you see people who can literally crack the sky while you're more or less a regular person, it does things to your self-worth. But a few stolen opportunities and getting mocked is better than being wanted by the law and always looking over your shoulder. That's assuming you don't end up dead by some scumbag who thought you weren't tough enough. Even at the other side of the coin, people like us are still near the bottom, and now the world would hate us even more for it. All villainy really is just slow suicide until you run out of luck. Izuku pursed his lips and looked down to the floor. But that's the thing. For most of my life I've considered offing myself because I couldn't measure up, and sometimes I'd figure why the hell not, since I was pretty much dead by the time I was declared as defective at 4. I wouldn't be like that fucker with the hand, but sometimes I considered just gathering all the case I had on hand, making a mask and grabbing a knife or a bat, or a hammer, and getting rid of as many shitbags as I could until my luck ran out. He squinted and shook his head, still not believing this actually happened. Of course I never actually did it because I'm too much of a coward to throw my life away with a meaningful purpose like that Stain guy, and I didn't want to hurt people just because of my anger despite how much I wanted to. I wouldn't be right to my mom and the few people who gave a shit about me at some point. So one night last year I got shit-faced and wrote a note on a napkin of all things and headed to the nearest bridge. His lungs flexed and sighed when the memory came flooding back. I figured since I couldn't, or rather wouldn't, take out my anger on other people, I figured I may as well do the next best thing and say fuck you to the world by taking my life into my own hands for fucking once. I couldn't be who I wanted to be, so I decided not to continue living as that person anymore. But since I couldn't change who I was, not alone at least, I figured I may as well end it. His hands twitched as if he could still feel the rail guard. I was standing on the side of this bridge overlooking the water, already doubting this idea when I caught a whiff of a menthol cigarette. Standing 20 feet away was this woman, this dejected, stoic-looking woman who seemed just as done with the world as I was, but she didn't look defeated. There was something about her that said here was someone who you could never beat down completely, and I tried to walk past her so I wouldn't traumatize some bystander with my bullshit. Then she started talking to me and I started to talk to her just to let it all out, and she convinced me that giving up living when I haven't even done anything worth remembering is the worst thing I could do. The sentimentality got the better of him and he actually smiled that he could say this and have it be completely true. From then on I started to get better with her help, and she was even the one who encouraged me to answer your ad in the paper. I haven't spent more than 3 days away from that woman in a year and she's been my steady the entire time. I'm alive because of her and she gives me a reason to live. This whole year with her by my side has been one of the few in my life where I haven't either considered jumping or going off the rails. She keeps me centered and I do the same for her. I want to become the best person I can for her, even if she is crazy. Shoto studied him for a silent, tense handful of minutes before letting a slightly dulled understanding shine. With everything you went through I can see a lot of that. Bakugo likely didn't help anything, probably the opposite despite everything he claims. You're not an evil person, Izuku, you're messed up, like everyone else is. Hell, ask any random off the street and they'll tell you they had a thought or 20 about doing bad. If anything, you're miles ahead of most of us with what last weekend demonstrated, because at least you admit it and handle it. That being said, I think you need to start going to therapy, and I'm saying that as your boss. So I'm gonna call up Shoto tonight and see if he can't get you hooked up with a shrink by tomorrow. Izuku sat up with shock ruling over him. His words fumbled in his throat for a moment as he struggled to find anything to say. But, I'm fine. I can function, so would I? Shoto placed a hand on his shoulder to quiet him as kindly as he could. At moment there came a far more weary and aged look to the crime fighter, one which had fought against the end of the world and lived. It's completely alright to go to a shrink in our line of work. The commission even mandates it through regulations, so nobody's going to look at you sideways. Hell, I go every couple of weeks just to sort some shit out from what happened in the war. Dread ate away at his soul when he imagined telling some quack in a suit even half of the things he's told Himiko. But what if I say the wrong thing? What if they put me in a psych ward? Snorting laughter came from the man as he stood up from his stool, laid down some money and slapped his sidekick on the back. Trust me, buddy, you're not as nuts as you think compared to half the people that get cycled through on the big wig's dime. You need to be a little unhinged to do this job for longer than 3 months, so consider this as a rite of passage. I'll see you this Friday, alright? He left before Izuku could reply, leaving the quirkless madman all on his lonesome to finish the rest of his whiskey. Sliding the glass forward and paying the bill, he moved out into the street and made his way to the nearest train station. Once he boarded the cart, his momentarily forgotten turmoil came back with vengeance as he wrestled with his unyielding love and devotion that stubbornly refused to weaken or die by even an inch, no matter how much he wished so. He should loathe and revile the woman on principle for what she did, but no matter what, his anger refused to be directed at her. Which left him impotent in the face of his own feelings, which shielded her like a bulwark and made him only angry at the fact those emotions were of stone and water which refused to give way to his moralistic and survival-motivated outrage. It was like trying to outscream a thunderstorm, and eventually he gave up when he found himself turning purple from the strain as he acted with all his mental might to push those things away and failed spectacularly. In his silence, Izuku hated himself even more as he felt that burning warmth that came with the fact that he would see her soon and that he actually wanted her almost as badly as when he was away. The side doors opened at his stop and he made his way back out to his block. Home was only a few minutes away, which allowed him some grumbling as he ate up the time until he was inside his apartment complex and at his door. He reached out to unlock it with his key, only for the door to unlock when he got near and Himiko to be standing in the doorway, dressed in her pajamas with an expression of genuine relief at him being here. "Hey handsome, what took you so long with Captain Diabetes?" A scowl nested on his face with his fists clenching over and over when he stepped forward. Himiko noticed immediately and raised a rather affronted eyebrow as he entered. The door shut behind him and she let her question out with a rather snappy tone. "What the hell's your problem?" Izuku turned with a furious look to his eyes and lurched forward with his teeth bared in a snarl. His arms wrapped around her so tightly that he could feel her bones under her skin. She struggled in his grasp as he brought her up against a wall and kissed her deeply, both sinking to the floor as his hands went up to her hair. The fire in him roared for more, to be let out against his vain and contemptible hate, which was even now being killed by his lust, his love, and everything else he placed inside this woman's soul that he needed like air. He was on top of her now, the both on the carpeted floor of his apartment as he began to shift and grope as his lips moved to her neck and suckled with a violent force while Himiko simply found a rhyme to his scratching, searching movements that made her burn in such a way that he could feel it right down in his bones. One of his hands lifted her dirty t-shirt without a second of hesitation, bringing her torso up along with it while another unhooked her bra with a thick snap that left her almost completely exposed. There was no fooling himself now, he needed her. All of her and nothing was going to stop him. He looked into her golden eyes and found the same need in her that made his soul sing and melt with those adoring, loving gazes that would only happen for him and him alone because he'd kill anyone who tried to take her away. Then right as he began to pull her pants down, Izuku pushed away from her and stood up as a sliver of that disgust he tried so hard to protect from his madness came back. He fumed and kicked at the empty air with a curse as he moved to the other side of the living room. God fucking damn it! What the hell is wrong with me? Himiko got up from the floor with her bra falling off in her haste as she gazed at him in open-mouthed bewilderment. What the fuck is going on with you? You've only been gone for a day and now you're acting all crazy. She stepped forward with a far softer and caring tone as she reached out a hand to touch him. You can tell me what's wrong, you know that. He stepped back from her hand which was battled with an apologetic pain within himself as he paced his face in his hands when the conflict became too much. He inhaled and looked back at his lover who continued to stare in concerned confusion. His tongue wagged and waited to bite, only for his heart and mind to hold it back as he found the right, yet honest words. I resent the fact that I love you so damn much. I hate how you could do anything short of cheating on me and I'd overlook it. I hate how you're so wonderful and delightful and everything I want in a woman that nobody else will do no matter how hard I try to convince myself otherwise in moments like this. I hate how I could see myself fighting by your side and loving you even when you were influenced by your quirk in your youth. I hate how much light you bring to my life when you ended so many others. His mouth clenched and his fists balled as he glared at her with raw yet mixed emotion. I can't stand how every word and oath I've ever said to you is true even when any other person would have left for someone who isn't a quarter of all the shit you come with. I hate how much I've given of myself to you and that I just can't get you out of my head and how you make my heart beat so much faster with excitement even now. I hate how much I admire your bravery and strength to the point where I'm proud that you're my one and only, that you're the woman I want to have children with. I hate how much I find you to be the only thing life is worth living for. He exhaled and cursed as he moved to the dining table and took a seat. He gauged Himiko, finding her still blindsided by his words. He felt better since a fraction of the things he felt about her got out, like all the waste in his head was partially gone. He looked at her and placed a hand on his face with a certain honesty only being slightly intoxicated can bring. Shoto had a copy of your file on hand, one he showed me not 2 hours ago. I saw pictures of what you did to those people, how you killed them just for turning you down. I looked at that and after a little bit of time, I don't feel much different towards you. I tried to rationalize it and dig into that fear like a mole to maybe pull away from you and all the horrible shit you did, but I can't. He leaned forward in his chair with a sharpness to his voice that drove the point in like a nail. You can slaughter people worse than goddamn livestock and I keep loving you just as hard because you mean everything to me. And I hate myself for it because I know I should have some repulsion to you and what you did regardless of our time together since that's what a good human being would do. His nose flared as he caged his hands and sighed in contemplation. But I don't. I don't really care about the people you tortured or the way you almost broke the world because that's not who you are now. And even if you were or if we met years before, I likely would have still stuck by you because my soul needs you. I try to convince myself that you're getting me ready to be murdered like you did to those people to maybe try and break this demented hold we have over each other, but we both know that isn't true. Your actions prove as much and you've been completely loyal, so I have no reason to leave. Contemplation hung in his eyes as he looked at her with far more logical lenses. Yet I feel like I should feel something, anything that lets me call evil for what it is, and what you did was without a doubt pure evil. It wasn't even that you killed people. You said from the very first time we met that you used to be an assassin and I figured out you were a League member later on. It was why and how you did it. And all I want to do is just keep going on as usual because you've proven you've changed since then by everything you showed me. Himiko recoiled from him like she'd been shot and smacked in the face. Yet there came a clarity that showed a genuine smile, one born of a lifetime of a desperate, dying dream finally coming to light. Her teeth showed through her lips and most of the pressure on her back appeared to vanish as she looked at him like she had found an oasis. I understand. You have every right to be disgusted with what I did to those people back in my youth, but once I got the help I needed to not be so crazy, I made a vow to fix myself and live better. The fact you're still here proves that I am, but can I do anything to help? There was a dangerous, impatient glare in him as Izuku got up from his chair and grabbed her firmly by the chin with all his held-back desire swimming in his eyes. The first thing you're going to do is get your things out of my apartment since Katsuki called off his hunt. Secondly, I'm going to need some time apart from you to manage this without my love for you getting in the way, because I think I have a problem that won't be good for us, so I'm going to fix it for our sake. His hands slid up to grip her cheeks like they were the softest of clay. I give you my word that I'll be back and that I won't leave you, but I need to think because I shouldn't be feeling this crazy about you. However, I want to make you a request, one that you'll think is nuts. She met him with those adoring eyes that glowed a contented and worshipful delight. Her voice was soft and dreamlike as she answered. What is it? He brought their heads together while his arms found her back, letting her joy find a spark in himself and feed off it. I want you to change your last name to mine. Not legally, at least not yet. I want you to consider your last name as Midoriya. If you can do that along with what you do for me already, then I'll be happy. I'll go sort my head out for a week or maybe a week and a half, and once I'm sorted out I'm going to take you. For now let's go to sleep since we have a lot ahead of us. A blush overcame her cheeks and she gripped the back of his head, bringing him to her as they locked lips. Pulling away 5 seconds later, Himiko smiled with an expression of pure bliss about her as her face was swallowed by pinkish red. Sure, but can I bite you for a while? All you said got me in a mood. Izuku returned the smile and scooped her up in his arms as he turned towards the bedroom. Of course. The sky cast a clear blue over the city as Izuku walked through the crowded streets. He was running a little early for work, but he needed the time to himself. Seeing the last wall of Himiko's past fall down was bad enough, it was his own reaction that did him in. Even if he couldn't lie to himself and claim he didn't love her anymore, his eagerness to leap over the atrocities disgusted him. Sure, Himiko was more than open about her past crimes and they had both finally gotten over that last hurdle with nothing left to hide, but he severely questioned his own sanity. There was even a part of him that whispered while they embraced on the bed last night and she bore her teeth into his skin, which was jealous of those people she killed in her youth for taking her attention and making her happy. Granted, in the larger scheme of maladaptive emotions that was the weakest compared with the urge to just smother her in his love. He had come back home after learning she was a monster who ruined lives personally for nothing more than her own vindictive amusement and a vengeful grasping for some sort of love. He learned this and nearly deflowered her on his apartment floor and demanded she use his last name. They rolled and squeezed on the bed with him leaving hickeys on her skin and her fangs biting into him until they both fell asleep. In the morning they kissed and cuddled like he hadn't learned the most horrifying thing a person can learn, all the while Himiko beamed with more pride than ever when she looked at him. And he looked at her the same way with his heart roaring and beating through that wonderful glow they gave each other. It was enough to make him wonder if he was getting as unwell as her at this point. Did that even bother him with how deeply entranced he was in her soul? After all, there had been plenty of moments where he earnestly wished that he was more willing to enjoy the physical pain she brings, that his very body could stitch itself back together so she could even use him like she did those poor people back in her youth. In a manner of thinking, Izuku knew he would have burned literally everything in his life for her. His career, his sidekick job, his family connections, and even his uprightness with the law, it was nothing compared to her loving loyalty. Himiko would have protested his thoughts and kept him grounded to what they had, but he knew himself enough to know it wasn't completely due to his obsession with her. No, the more he considered it, Izuku realized he enjoyed having an excuse to just do as he would with someone's love in mind. He secretly enjoyed the dark thoughts that swelled from the edges of his mind when he considered Himiko and her plight. The justification to finally act out and not be completely turned away. In a way, the fury and dreadful energy that filled him when he wanted to protect her, to keep her close and by his side, was just as addicting as the warmth she summoned in his soul. He liked being the dangerous one for once instead of the person needing saving, the one who could force his will into the world and know he was in the right. The civilized, decent part of himself despised these thoughts, but with Himiko and her demonic freedom becoming so apparent before she turned herself in all those years ago, he found himself almost jealous. Granted, he wasn't of so psychotic a persuasion to make revenge-based erotic slaughter his motivation, but she got to live her own way with her own rules and adventures with nobody daring to tell her what to do. Something a fucking faceless drone like him never could. He could never break away even if he wanted to because he lacked the power and the tenacity to do so. He even tried to off himself over such trivial bullshit at the time, so what grand, all-consuming villain does that? Who the fuck that could shape world would do that? Nobody who actually can change the world, that's for damn sure. Himiko, she was just a teen when she ran away and decided to act out her will, as evil and clouded by insanity as it was. There was nobody around for her and she still managed to make grown men with years of heroic expertise fear for their lives. She didn't have an offensive quirk and still shook up the world. Himself on the other hand was so pathetic that he needed to be browbeaten into not giving up his life over depression, if that even was what was wrong with him. He had always been the kicking boy ever since he was born from his first day of life to now, and he never once behaved how he wanted, not once, and instead hid his emotions until they were literally eating him alive. Maybe if he had snapped off one of Katsuki's fingers back when they were younger or fought more against anyone who wronged him, then perhaps he would have lived a better life. Oki and Himiko were the only things that helped him at the darkest points in his life, with Okako being a pleasant surprise while times were good. Everything else was a sea of indifference that drowned his soul in ice. The problem was that he never had the balls to break away, or maybe it was the fact he couldn't annihilate people with a flick of his finger like a few spoiled people who were just born better. His brow furrowed, causing his mind to wander as he got closer to his work. He considered the original villain, the one who was supposedly behind all the calamity and gave that hand, Tomura, his powers. Imagine being born with a power that can literally take away people's quirks, the very thing most people build their whole lives around, and use it as your own. You'd be bound to have a god complex with how much inhuman power that would bring, and in a way it would be correct. You'd have all the superpowers in the world and could literally steal what made people special, what they lived on, to your own benefit for any reason. Giving it more thought, it wasn't a surprise that the old man turned into a narcissistic psychopath. Hell, most people get a big head just for having one decent quirk like Kaken. If you could get any power you wanted at any point, assuming you hunted the right mark down from the time you were 4, it was guaranteed that you'd see other people as less than shit. Although in a twisted way he did get his comeuppance when the person he wanted to manipulate turned around and stole everything right from under him and turned him into dust. A tightness overcame his chest suddenly as he pictured the concept of such a thing, of all that power which turned a mortal man into the closest thing to a living god humanity had seen. He imagined it, having such a gift that you could literally shape the world in your image like a divine figure. He questioned how that would feel, to have such force flow under the very atoms of his being. There was a lingering, clawing hunger in his spine, one driven by selfish greed and envy. For a brief instant he felt a tingle in his brain, one that demanded a chase as he saw the image of that incorporeal which could let any man rule as God. He smiled as a deep longing filled him, like one possessed of a drive to conquer. There was a treasure that could make him the strongest person in the world, that could free him from all suffering and let him shape the world to his desire. Yet that possibility, as astronomical as it would have been even if he had known Himiko back then, was scuttled when Katsuki blew the owner's head off. For some reason that made him resent the man even more, but soon enough questions started to form in his head. Oddly moral questions, as he was a hair's width away from entering his work. If he had that power, what would he do with it? For some reason Izuku stopped where he was and looked up, taking in the sky and the sun, and knew of the vast endless ocean of stars beyond his sight. Somehow that struck a chord with him as he went and clocked in. Taking a seat at his desk and readying his workspace, Izuku began to let that feeling follow. Why hasn't humanity taken out to the stars yet? Back before the emergence, nations were able to make spacecraft that went to the moon with technology less complex than the phone in his pocket. And yet the whole of mankind's accomplishment with space travel was the International Space Station from almost 500 years ago, which had long since been crashed into the sea. It was understandable since humans were bound by rules and laws that kept them mundane, but now there were individuals who could easily bend those rules and transcend the limits of what was possible. And yet, for all our potential having exploded into something close to divine, we aren't any different than when they built those shitty rockets. You had people who could make steel from atoms and oxygen from carbon, along with more wondrous things he couldn't even imagine. And society had become obsessed with what was going on with the mundane, dividing it into a matter of heroes and villains when it could have transcended Earth and colonized the stars. Izuku let out a chuckle at the idea. For all the original demon's supposed power and might, he squandered his potential like the rest of the people he looked down on. The man who could literally do anything, who could shape the world however he wished, decided to act like a malicious spoiled brat and rule the world like a tyrant until he was killed by the monster he created. When he could have taken all the quirks he wanted in secret until he was able to make humanity move beyond Earth or colonize the deepest seas. He could have let people have their fantasy and be the one who contributed to mankind more than any other before him. He could have ruled an empire spanning the stars and allowed humanity to foster and grow infinitely, but instead he was as short-sighted and petty as the lot of them. Not that Izuku was much better himself, but it would have been so interesting to live with a godlike figure as a scientist king that brought mankind to the stars in a golden age. That would have made life so much better, and ironically people would have likely given the guy what he wanted without having to waste so much time breaking the world. But at the end of the day it was all fantastical speculation. He was just a man with no power who could do the best he could. That Messiah had failed long before he was born, and the one who potentially could have lifted mankind up had gotten killed before anything amazing could have happened. Not that the decaying king was the kindest person, but from what Himiko told him there might have been a chance that he actually would listen to reason. After all, this old, stagnant society was what failed him. So why wouldn't he have jumped at being able to build one that was unlike any other before it? One with endless possibilities and potential and wild freedom, that Earth would just be one amongst many worlds populated by godlike humans. A pause came to Izuku as he stopped his typing, a resentful regret filling his soul. Perhaps he could have actually helped form that evolution, whispered into the king's ear, and fostered a new world for mankind to flourish on. Visions of himself and Himiko dancing on the firm green earth of some far-off star played out before him. A place with no worries and dread, only the comforts of a warm home and endless possibilities to go where they wished in the cosmos, with only each other for company while mankind spread out to infinity amongst burning stars and virgin worlds with the help of its man-child king. He chided himself for how foolish that all sounded, but nothing was impossible in this new age of power. Still, he pushed it to the side as he refocused on his work, secretly thankful such a thought pushed away his disgust with himself and the darkness in his soul for a time. However, even as he typed robotically, the concept wouldn't completely vanish. It remained like a shadow in the back of his head, chipping away at him with its presence. He finished the last document and found an odd twitch to his fingers that wouldn't leave, the idea still pressing down like a stone. Looking around and finding he wasn't being watched, Izuku opened his desk drawer and pulled out a pocket notepad. Flipping it open as his next assignment was in the process of loading, he set the date in the upper right-hand side and scribbled down the words "The Star Wars Expansion Initiative" at the top. Izuku wasn't sure what he was doing, but his mind started to turn and crank with his hand dashing across the small page with short segments of concepts and rules and ideas before he pulled away and returned to his work. Time flew by, and what felt like seconds later there came a tap on his shoulder. Turning around, he could see Tensen standing behind him with a grin. "Hey Midoriya, it's been a while." Izuku shrugged and grabbed his notepad as he signed out for lunch. "I suppose it has." The redhead continued to smile at him while they walked to the break room. "Sorry we haven't hung out much, but things have been going on. What about you? Are you and your girl doing okay?" Izuku came to a halt and shivered for a moment before bringing his eyes down to the notepad in his hand. "We're fine, it's just, let's say I'm starting to get as nuts as her." The fire user whistled as they took a seat. "That bad, eh?" "Well, don't worry, Natsumi makes me crazy too." Izuku didn't look up and continued to scribble as these new ideas swept him away from the problems in his soul. Instead, he began to think out loud as his hand continued to make his thoughts into reality. "Have you ever wondered why we haven't advanced to the point where we've colonized outer space?" Tensen raised an eyebrow as he began to chew away at his lunch. "Not really, why?" "Nobody's thought of space travel in years." More pen strokes were had as Izuku flipped a page. "But isn't that an issue? We have people able to bend the very laws of physics, and our society is still the same as 500 years ago." The redhead considered it and answered. "I guess. I mean, we already have everything we need on Earth, and with quirks being a thing, why would we even want to leave?" The pen stopped as Izuku looked up quizzically at his coworker. "You mean to tell me you wouldn't want to see the very edge of reality and see things we can only dream about?" Tensen shrugged and chewed a bit of rice. "Of course I would, but if it was possible we would have done it by now. Even with all the crazy stuff quirks let us do, we still need to be realistic, and reality says we can't, at least not right now." A glare was leveled at the redhead, one so potent and filled with venom that it made him pause when Izuku spoke with an almost threatening tone. Someone else said that to me once and I proved him wrong. We have the abilities of gods at our fingertips and we keep wasting it on a one-sided worldview. I'm not saying heroism is bad, but if you gathered the right kind of people together, then there could be a new age where we move from a comic book to a space opera in spandex. There was a challenging yet friendly edge to the redhead as he sat upright and grinned. And so you think you're going to be the one to do it? What's your plan? It came to Izuku as easy as breathing. Simply, I'll focus on the one group of people who have always moved history. People with too much time on their hands. Think about it, some NEET living in his apartment could have a quirk that lets them survive perfectly in a vacuum, or a bored socialite could be able to create breathable oxygen with a thought. I mean, your girlfriend can literally make plants ripen and grow at will. If we terraformed Mars or the Moon, then someone like her would be invaluable, and there's likely other people who can do similar things, but they just can't see it. At that, Tenzin furrowed his brow, seeming to actually consider it. I see your point, but I think it would be easier if you just stuck to the hero stuff. Most of the fury left the green eat and his demeanor eased as he began to munch on a cup of ramen he brought. Probably, and I still am, but it might work, so that's good enough for me. The bell dinged, summoning them back to work, which Tenzin smiled at as he left the break room. Well, good luck. Also, I'll see if I can't clear up my schedule by Friday, okay? He proceeded ahead, leaving the quirkless man to his thoughts as he shut the notebook and returned to his desk. The idea continued to begrudge him like a needy hound, begging for his attention while he strived to finish up the rest of the day's duties until it died down to a whimper. Hours later, he eventually made it to the end of the workday and signed as he stood up with the weight of what really were his problems coming back in force. He tried to drift back to his fantasies of space, but in his mental exhaustion he was forced to contend with his own self-loathing. What was even worse was that he couldn't see Himiko, but at the moment he wasn't sure if that was better or worse for his mental health. On one hand, he had a very real urge to quite literally break down the walls to get to her. On the other, he was still repulsed by how badly he wanted to embrace her and overlook her literally torturing people to death. Fuck, he even felt willing to let her release all her sick urges on him so he could enjoy being the source of her happiness. It was one thing to murder, even if it was out of insanity and quirk-driven necessity, but to do what she did, and yet he still wanted her, badly. He wanted to throw any pretense away and rush over to her, to unleash every ounce of love he had from a near lifetime of repression and just say I love you in a way that fully conveyed it. He hated himself for being so chained to her and not looking at this like a logical, reasonable person would. Yet he hated the thought of not continuing the life they built even more so. She hadn't betrayed him, so his pride and honor was still intact, which only bolstered the psychotic warmth in his heart. Looking at where he put the notepad, Izuku scooped it up as he clocked out for the day and hoped the dream inside would keep his loathing away. Tenzin had already left before him, so there was no one to walk with, which made the emptiness at Himiko's absence even more. To his own shameful admission, he felt beyond sad and more akin to having lost a limb for how bad this sorrow nestled in his core. The world seemed a little colder, even if he knew it was a temporary thing, until he understood that he wasn't losing his mind, but damn did it suck. At least he had other people he could talk to and kill time with, which was infinitely better than before. His home was likely empty, and it was Wednesday, so everyone was busy. Except maybe Kaken and Shoto. He grumbled at the former, but in light of everything, Izuku knew he didn't absolutely hate the man. Even if he still carried most of those old wounds, literally, Katsuki had a tough enough time instead of the celebrity high life Izuku believed he did. If anything, the guy was just sad and clearly needed a friend, which was a fucking storm of emotions for him to feel if there ever was one. But the guy would likely drop whatever to placate his request to hang out, which was bearable. Honestly, out of everyone else on Earth, he was the only one who could stand Katsuki enough to deal with him. To a weak degree, he even missed the guy in a concerned please don't do anything to hurt yourself kind of way. Shoto, on the other hand, had a family to look after, which put a whole different dynamic on things since he didn't want to take time away from his family. Although, Himiko had told him that she was going to ask to have Shoto show him her file, which was kind of irrelevant now, but the thought still very much counted. So shouldn't he get in contact with the guy? Then there was the fact that Shoto said he was going to have Shoto recommend him a therapist last night, so looking out into the sidewalk by the building, the question was answered by the elemental hero himself, standing with a thermos in hand. Seeing the man made a surge of guilt build up in his chest, like he had been a bother, and now this poor family man who hadn't done a single thing wrong was sent to deal with it. However, he was admittedly happy to see someone he knew, and Shoto didn't appear pissed. If anything, he looked mildly bored. The heterochromia eyes of the hero regarded him coolly as he moved towards the sidekick, causing Izuku to become even stricken by his guilt at taking up the man's time. He kept eye contact and tried not to let the turmoil inside him show as he forced out a meek smile. "Hey, Shoto. Everything okay?" The icy hot hero remained utterly stoic, unscrewing his thermos and taking a long sip. "Shouldn't I be the one asking you that?" Izuku recalled like he had gotten called out at school again, but he didn't completely shut down. "I guess. So what brings you here first?" He shrugged and began to walk due east with Izuku following suit. "It's interconnected given how it both relates to you and your partner. She's already filled me in on what happened, and I did get a call from Shoto last night which proves her case. Now, I do need to ask as her officer, did you tell Shoto anything at all about her that could identify her?" The sidekick pondered for a moment through a drunken haze that he thankfully remembered. "No, but I think he sort of suspects something. I talk about my relationship every so often and never give names. But, frankly, I think that's the least of my problems." The multicolored hero raised another eyebrow at the somber tone. "Oh? You mean to say you actually have issues being with someone who legitimately gets off on drinking blood and seeing you in pain?" There was a hint of overt condescension that would have been masked by his chillingly even tone if it wasn't so blatant. Izuku pursed his lips and shrugged. "Quite the opposite. I'm still crazy about her, and that bothers me." Anguished conflict showed on his face as he took stock of his own perverse devotions. Looking to the air as he went. "I mean, I finally learned why she was always so guarded even after I figured out who she ran with in her teens, and it's one of the worst things I've seen. But I can't look at it like a normal, moral person because it's her. I try so hard to make myself go she's done inhumanly horrible shit to people, so feel some disgust and anger, but I fucking can't. I literally cannot stop feeling like she's my whole world even when she did shit that bad." He hung his head in his hands as it got worse. "And to top it off, there's part of me that's actually jealous that they were her focus for even a day. I've had times where I wished I had a regeneration quirk so she could do whatever she wanted to me, where I could be willing to do shit that bad, and it isn't like Himiko is asking for this. She's always been the responsible one, but I want to be her sole outlet for everything no matter what, and it makes me wonder if I'm making her mental state worse by being so willing to be subject to her whims. He shook his head in dismay. "I wonder if I'm actually becoming crazy, because normal people don't think like this." A hum came from the elemental hero as he watched the whole thing unveil from the side and sipped his coffee. "The fact you're able to make that assertion means you aren't, at least not completely. Though, it's clear what you mean. Which is why I've taken the liberty to schedule an appointment for you with a therapist. She's the same one who handles Himiko's therapy, so there won't be an issue if you go into detail about your life." A sour taste rested in the officer worker's mouth. He wasn't against therapists and admitted it would be the best way to get help, but going to one makes him feel like a mental case. Which he very well may be what he's becoming. Sighing as he looked at the semi-retired hero with exhausted, defeated eyes, Izuku relaxed somewhat. Deciding that he needed help anyway, so why not? "Fair enough, when should I show up?" Shoto raised up a watch he was wearing and studied it for a moment. "In about 1 hour from now." Izuku blinked like he had misheard, only to accept it like every other inconvenience life threw at him. Inhale thank you, Shoto. Let's be sure to not be late, and if you need to go back home I can make my way there if you give me the directions." The icy hot hero pointed with his index finger around his mug towards the ever-going streets, seeming to have the patience of a monk. "I don't mind wasting a day. Momo has the baby and I figured you and I could have a conversation." Izuku pursed his lips with a numb dread as he walked in lockstep with the man. "About?" Another sip of the thermos was had. "About your relationship. It's mainly for my own curiosity, but ever since you showed up Himiko has improved substantially with her mental health. From what she's reported to the commission, she's never been happier and more grateful that she had turned her life around. Which is a far cry from the jaded stoicism in most of her letters. Which makes me wonder, have you seriously talked to her about marriage?" Izuku paused with a self-conscious shame, like he had suddenly walked around naked. "Not recently, why?" The wind whistled in a sharp breeze that chilled under Shoto's touch, something he seemed to barely notice. Because when she asked for you to see her files, she mentioned how this is what she was looking for and she only talks like that in reference to romance. Frankly, I'm shocked you even tolerate half of the things about her, much less have this much devotion. It was then Izuku turned and glared with an evil eye. Who the fuck else would have done so much for me when I was at my lowest? The only reason I know you and the rest is because of her. She's the reason I'm still fucking alive, and what's more is who the hell would love me as strongly as she does? Shoto met it with a refined glance that was far too well-mannered. How many women wouldn't start drinking your blood and cutting you to prove their love? The glare hardened to a lethal, angry point. A whole bunch of soulless, weak cowards who never once stood for a damn thing in their meaningless, plastic lives. Himiko's eccentric, but she's loyal to a fault and the strongest person I know, so she's worth more than any other woman. Shoto kept his demeanor. She's murdered people due to a quirk-induced insanity that was so bad the courts legally couldn't put her on death row for her actions. Everything about her was a result of a neglect and abuse from two horrible parents that made her into a killer. Everything you're praising her for is because she was psychotically gone for most of her life, so it isn't a thing to be admired. The truth stung, but Izuku merely rolled it off with a certain passive aggressiveness. Maybe, but at least she did some shit with her life. That's more than most people can say. Bitterness filled his soul to where it was palatable to the son of fire, and it was regarded calmly, if not outright casually. Are you envious of the fact she was a villain? Izuku turned with a snarl of bared teeth as his anger finally popped, sending to a standstill while he narrowed his ire at the elemental user. It's more than fucking that. I know she did wrong and that group she was with were fucking evil and deserved to get axed, but it doesn't change the fact she still went on in the face a world that wanted her dead and nearly bit its throat out. Yeah, she has her issues and maybe she is evil to a degree, but Himiko has done more with her life in 2 years than someone who goes with the grain. After all, what the hell would you know about Dash? The words died in his throat as memories of who burned down the Todoroki estate and killed Endeavor came rushing back. Suddenly that righteous anger was replaced with a genuine shame at his actions and lowered his eyes to the man. Sorry about that. To his eternal surprise, Shoto didn't appear murderously enraged or ready to turn his blood into ice. Instead, he looked all the same as he normally did. It's fine, and I get it. You see a quality in her you wish you had during the worst parts of your life, so it leads to an excuse of the crimes and lends itself to an idealization regardless of what you see. Now Izuku leaned back as a grave concern nestled in his chest at the implications of the words. You didn't feel the same? Shoto shrugged and continued walking, not particularly bothered by anything. Yes, I did. My home life was as bad as the papers said, and when I didn't see another way out or I focused on the pain my father gave me, I started to almost envy my brother for doing what I never could. But thankfully I had people around me that gave me hope and a reason to not take the plunge into villainy. Given your own experience in life and being around someone like Bakugo, it's natural you'd cling to some twisted ideal of another person who does what you wanted to do out of revenge or to feel like you're not a freak. He twisted the lid on his thermos shut and stored it in a coat liner pocket. Believe it or not, that isn't a rare thing in people who go through traumatic experiences. Most of the people in the reform program have the same thought process about someone who showed them what they could have been. The real issue is when those thoughts almost transform into actions which are always followed by dire consequences. That's where most either seek help or go over the edge. The hero gave a calculated yet obviously curious glance his way. But how exactly would you think Himiko would take you admiring her criminality given all it cost her? A cringe stuck deep in his core as the image of those golden eyes judging him filled his mind. He could already feel the weight of her anger and that overly patronizing tone which was sharpened upon a far more dangerous sensation. Not well. Not well at all. But that doesn't change the fact that she still fought and made something of herself, even if it was disturbing. Izuku paused when realized what he was talking about and eased himself out of his mental frenzy. His knuckles popped under tenseness that held back when he spoke again with shame. Shoto, what the hell does it say about me when I'm more unwell than her? I've never had those sorts of urges like she did due to her quirk, and I was docile for most of my life, and now I'm having issues. The half shrugged as a building loomed on the horizon which grew closer by the second. It means you bottle a lot of things up for years and now it's starting to seep out while you use her as an outlet for all those things you kept inside. Like I said before, it isn't anything new, and I was the same way with my friends, only they weren't in line with my destructive way of thinking. If anything, My wife gave me a reason to overlook the resentment of my life, and I'm certain Himiko does the same for you, but she still represents a mirror to what you could have been. Izuku halted and turned with a defensiveness about him, but Shoto continued to walk towards the building as they passed its gate and came upon the entrance. Finding it useless to carry the point, Izuku followed after and took in the waiting room which greeted him. It was a typical bland grey and white walled setup with chairs rowed around the sides in front of a glassed-off reception area. There were a few other souls sitting in wait with shifting uncomfortable eyes that rarely looked up. Izuku did his best to keep his sight to himself as he followed Shoto to the receptionist, who regarded the hero with a casual smile. She was a pleasant enough middle-aged woman who slipped him a registration form and waited as it was filled out before Izuku was handed it and put in his own information. Surprisingly, there wasn't any wait time as he was allowed in and told to find room 6A while Shoto parked himself in the waiting room. The hallway had a few turns and twists, but a few minutes later he found the room and opened the door. What was waiting on the other side was a middling-sized room with soft lighting that illuminated just enough. The floor was carpeted with a rather nice smell of incense coating the air. A red leather sofa lingered on one side of the room, and directly across from it was a black padded chair. In the chair was a well-dressed woman who was clearly in her late 30s. She was a stout woman with violet eyes that glowed with a certain strength that felt as if they could pierce the soul. Her hair was a light brown and her face was baseline with a slight tint of makeup. She smiled at him in an overly warm way and set the clipboard she had to the side. "Hello, you must be Izuku." Her voice was crisp, sharp, but not biting like most women he knew. Standing upright and trying to maintain a certain level of professionalism about him, Izuku returned the smile and placed his hands behind his back. "Yes, and you would be Dr. Naksha, correct?" The woman nodded and gestured to the sofa. "Indeed, now would you mind taking a seat?" Without a word he sat down in the unreasonable firm seat, remaining upright and avoiding lingering eye contact out of a fear of being rude. Dr. Naksha picked up her clipboard again and uncapped a pen as she continued with a now unnerving amount of friendliness that felt manufactured. "So, what brings you in today?" Izuku darted his eyes around and began to twiddle his thumbs as shame avalanches down onto his soul, along with a strange dread of saying too much. But he did manage to speak regardless. "That's a complicated question. I have a few things going on and I understand we only have so much time, but..." The doctor raised a dismissive hand and grinned. "Please, talk about whatever. I get paid by the commission, so it's no big deal." The quirkless man pursed his lips and lowered his eyes to the floor as he tried to form the right words. "Well, before I start going into things, I know you can't exactly discuss other patients, which is more than fine. But I heard that you also work with a woman by the name of Himiko Ito." His hands began to turn as he chewed on his words. "Would that be correct?" There came a slight, yet sharp edge to the woman now. One that seemed radically different, yet oddly fitting. "May I ask why you want to know?" Izuku rolled his palms and inhaled. "Because she's my significant other and I'm fully aware of what she did in the past. Only, that's one of the reasons I'm here, and her sponsor said you were responsible for her, so I could speak openly. If you aren't, then it complicates things." The harshness left the violet eyes of the doctor and she even began to chuckle. "Ah, so you're that Izuku." "Yes, Himiko has said quite a lot about you, however I can't go into detail about what she and I discussed due to ethical reasons." He raised his hands up in surrender. "That's completely fine, I just want to make sure I'm not throwing her under the bus." There came a pause and he forced out his next words. "Recently though, I had a look at her file and saw exactly what she did in her free time when she was still on the wrong side of the law. Now, I've been aware of the group she was affiliated with for a while beforehand and knew she had a tendency for blood due to her quirk from day one. She has always been transparent with me about everything and she never hid much of her past, so I always accepted it. Everything from her taste for blood on down, I've just shrugged and went on with her because I wasn't too bothered by it because she's trustworthy enough." He inhaled as his own disgust bubbled back up. "Yet, that's the thing that worries me. I finally learned about the thing she kept quiet about from the start and pushed away my advances for good reason. I learned how she did things utterly unforgivable by any moral metric that I should be rightly repulsed by, and instead I go back home slightly drunk and start loving her even more. I start berating how deeply I adore her and all her flaws and more, and outright say that I don't care about what she did to those innocent people." His head was in his hands and he dragged them down as the realization stung even more. I don't care that she butchered people like animals because she means that much to me. Seconds passed while he nestled his head, trying to wrestle with his thoughts when the doctor's oddly warm voice cut in like a song. Well, that certainly is a lot to take in, and there's definitely more to this than at first glance. But just so I can better understand things, would you mind explaining in your own words why you feel that way? Izuku eventually freed his hands with a sigh and clicked his teeth. I don't know. In all the time I've known her, Himiko had been there for me when nobody else was. Though I never reached out to anyone beforehand, so it's my own fault. That aside, I find her to be great. Like literally one of the best things to ever happen to me, since she's been one of the few to ever willingly help me improve. Then there's the fact she's so fascinating as a person. She's sadistic yet kind-hearted and strong yet warm. And he inhaled when he realized his mind was drifting away from where it needed to be. I think I feel this way because Himiko had helped me so much in life when nobody else had. She's also been the one person I could use as an emotional pillar for everything. Whenever I have an issue, I know I could go to her about it. Granted, I usually don't unless it's important, but that's regardless. I also have over a year invested in our relationship, and she hadn't done anything that would make me break away, despite her more crimson tastes with intimacy. She also gave me the only time since the calamity where I don't feel depressed. Dr. Naksha nodded and wrote some things down on her clipboard before regarding him pleasantly. Do you have a history of depression? Izuku shrank back in his seat, suddenly feeling like he was under a microscope again. Hasn't Himiko told you how we met? The doctor pointed her pen at him reflexively. We're not discussing her at the moment. I asked for your opinion on the matter. He looked to the side and lowered his vision. Not medically, but for most of my life I had these times where I really stopped caring about anything. At first I would be pissed off at the world for how my life turned out, but that would usually turn into indifference. I'd just be so done with everything that, most days it felt like I was waiting to die, that I was wasting time until my body rotted away. Ironic I was saved by a former villainess of all people, but yeah. The pen twisted in her fingers and the doctor hummed in curiosity. Interesting. Would you mind explaining what changed in between the time you met Himiko and now that was different from before you were acquainted? A laugh actually came from the man as he saw what he thought was obvious. That's easy. She gave me the motivation to actually try and live instead of just surviving. Sure, my life wasn't overly tragic and I'm gainfully employed, but I had nothing to live for, no dreams to chase. Then I meet her and she gives me the direction and the kick in the ass I needed to achieve my dream to some degree. But that makes it sound overly simple, like I'm with her just because of this when it isn't the case. Himiko is more to me than that. She's the person who gave me a chance to live again for the first time in a long time, and I'd burn that hero's dream of mine for her in a heartbeat. I'd trade anything for her to always be by my side because she's who I need, and being with her for all the flaws and baggage is worth it to me since she gives me a life worth living. The pen flipped again as a glint nestled in the therapist's gaze. What exactly is a life worth living to you? One where you're not alone. A tenseness came to him as he pondered it and relaxed somewhat. A life worth living is one where you could be dying in a gutter and think back without regret being the first thing you see. When I was single, things were numbing to say the least. I had a whole host of silent regrets, and here comes this girl who has more regrets and tragedy than anyone, living a life even worse than mine, and she still has the balls to spit in the world's eye when it wants her dead. And to top it off, he paused and measured his words to not get the wrong point. I know what she did was abhorrent all around and that she worked with the worst of the worst, but she still fucking did it. She nearly changed the world. Sure, it might have been for the absolute worst, but she almost succeeded and still has that to be proud of. Hell, the sheer fact she has the will to get up every day and face a world that wants her dead is astounding. Then add to the fact she genuinely wants to build a life with me, of all people. That is a life worth living, but I guess you could also use All Might or Crimson Riot as examples since they lived without much regrets even if one was crippled. She studied him for a moment before writing on her clipboard again. So you assume Himiko has a life worth living now? Izuku shrugged as something came loose in his brain. To a degree. She had her life and now she's about as down as I am, which I guess is why we go so well together. I mean, she's not who she was in her youth and she's done her damnedest to get better, and I'm here for her every step of the way. The point is she never gives up and she works hard for a good life, so I'll do the same for her. The doctor continued to fiddle her pen and study him. So what exactly would that good life with her look like to you? Because you sound dedicated enough to the idea. Izuku paused at the question only to find a smile creep upon his lips. A good life with her would be, where it's just us, and maybe the other woman we see together. There'd be this nice wide house, maybe 2 stories tall with a nice picket fence in the middle of nowhere. I'd have a decent enough job and Himiko would have her writing gigs, but would mostly stay at home most of the time, and maybe Okuko retires from her job and lives with us. There'd be enough money in the bank to where we didn't have to worry about bills, and Himiko would have all the blood she want. There'd even be a separate room for all her art stuff. Or maybe it'd be a sex dungeon she'd drag me into whenever the mood hit her. But we'd also have kids together and give them all the best things we could and help make life better for them. The smile lingered far longer than he felt it should, and with it came that warmth that screamed for his lover. Suddenly he was almost giddy and drunk on the addictive emotions she brought out of him. He squirmed as he fought to sit still against the urge to simply leave and find her so he could smother her in his emotions. The doctor wrote down more notes and had an understanding about her as she responded. That's not a bad life at all, but I'm left to ask, how often do you two spend time apart? For once Izuku knitted his brows in confusion. We don't. For all the time we've known each other I've always gone to her place after work or spent the weekend. The most I've gone without seeing her is 3 days, and that was only due to extenuating circumstances. Another hum came from the woman. I figured as much. Now let me ask, do you have anything outside of your relationship with her that you enjoy? Another dream perhaps? Izuku pursed his lips and shrugged, not sure what to say. Yes, but also not really. Don't get me wrong, I mostly enjoy the sidekick thing, but it isn't really as grand as I thought hero work could be, although I have no intention of quitting. I have my day job which is bearable. It's a job after all, so take that for what you will. However, she always comes first, no matter what. An eyebrow was raised towards him by the doctor. So when exactly do you come first? You can't live only for her well-being alone, since you still have to look after yourself. There wasn't a thought that came from that. Instead he merely recoiled slightly. I don't know. I've never really thought to look after myself. Usually it's always been me taking care of someone else. From my mom, to my childhood friend, to the first girl I fell in love with before the world went mad, I've always focused on the other person. Himiko's no different. I know she can operate just fine by herself, but I feel like she genuinely needs me. Maybe not as much as those other people in my past, but still. Besides, so long as I'm not dead, then I'm taking care of myself. Dr. Nagsha focused her eyes on him with an uncomfortable amount of scrutiny. The violet of her irises seemed to dig deep into his soul as the substance of his words was tasted. Have you ever had a time in your life where you were acting out of pure selfishness, Midoriya? Not due to having to help someone else or defend them, but to attain your own desires with no other motive? Izuku shrank back and thought for a moment when he had found a memory like it. No, I think I have 2 like those. The first was when I was 16 and smashed a couple of guys' teeth in with a 2x4 because they insulted the girl I was seeing at the time. The other was when I was on patrol and some Stain wannabe had a sword to my neck and started prattling on about how there should be more people like Dynamite. That pissed me off, so I grabbed his blade and started beating him until he passed out. He blinked as he realized a pattern was forming. I have a problem, don't I? The doctor regarded him frankly, but not dismissively, as she scribbled down in her notes. Yes, but compared to most people sent my way, it isn't as bad as you'd believe. Most individuals have to have a certain amount of self-interest, otherwise they couldn't survive, and when those matters of self-interest or personal want are supplanted or overlooked for too long, then violent anger emerges as a relief valve. For most people, those feelings rarely get to a point where they accumulate to such a point due to most people being able to vent it through other means. Yet with you, given what I've read from your file and the tidbits Himiko tells me, you never allow yourself to even acknowledge those feelings until they explode. She flipped a page and continued. Which is certainly in line with an upbringing such as yours, where you always felt the need to support everyone around you regardless of your own desires. That isn't to say altruism is bad, not at all, but you seem to have been completely consumed by the ideal until it turned toxic. Which leads me to a bit of a hypothesis regarding your relationship with Himiko, if you wouldn't mind me airing it out. Izuku felt oddly removed hearing that. He was paying attention, but it felt more like watching the whole conversation in third person. Go ahead. Dr. Nagsha turned yet another page and began to write anew. I believe the reason you cling so tightly to her, to the point of even considering throwing away everything else about your life, is because to you, she is the embodiment of your innate selfish desires. For one such as yourself who had always followed and done as others had wished of you, finding someone like Himiko who lived as the exact opposite of that for most of her life and actively choosing to be deeply involved with them is, in of itself, an act of rebellion. A self-guided choice which leads to a glimpse at the thing you never got to be, namely your own person. You had always lived by the whims of others and she lived, for a time at least, for her own warped desire. Both of which were catastrophic for you both, yet the two of you admire that quality each lacked. She looked up and smiled kindly as if reliving some memory. Himiko has praised your ability to remain in the flow of society despite having every reason to break away. She admires how collected you had to be to continue for years as you were before breaking, whereas she loathes how she wasn't strong enough to hold on when she snapped all those years ago. You, on the other hand, admire her for the willpower she had to break away from the norm that you had thrust upon you from birth. For being the epitome of selfish freedom and taking command of one's own life. Yet if either of you were to say as much, it would be reduced with scorn from each other. You also view Himiko as a justifiable act of selfishness due to her needing you, ergo you can continue to be in proximity to what you wanted to be without shame. The pen spun in her hands and the words continued. Not only that, but you view her as the last bastion for your own desires, feelings, and inner needs, hence the intense urge to protect and seclude her away. Because if that final validation of your inner self vanishes, then you'll be left with nothing but a lifetime of violent anger which had only recently been slowly vented out. She kept smiling and even laughed slightly as she took stock of the man. There's a great irony to your relationship and why you value each other so much. You both see what could have been and try your damnedest to meld those together into a happy, functional life. And the amazing thing is that it's working spectacularly. There weren't really words to say what he felt. Izuku knew the woman was speaking the truth, and in hindsight, it was damn obvious, but he suddenly felt guilty. Like he had used Himiko instead of loving her just because she was her. His face slumped as he studied the facts and decided to move forward. So what? Are you saying I'll snap and start murdering people if Himiko leaves? The doctor grinned with a slightly smug satisfaction. I never said murder, but you know that the case. In all fairness, it's a mutual issue between her and you because she's confessed to wanting to finally give up and paint the streets red if you left, since there wouldn't be a reason to try and get the level of normality you maintain despite your issues. You both use each other as role models for what was lacking in each other's lives before meeting, which is one of the reasons you cling so tightly together. Now, that is far from a bad thing considering where you both were before meeting. However, for you, at least Izuku, I think the best way to lessen those inner demons is to start being more assertive. The green of the sidekick's eyes became sharp and angry at those words. Sitting up, he could barely suppress a scowl with how wrapped up in emotion he was. That's easier said than done when my entire life can be upended by mouthing off to the wrong person. Thankfully, the doctor didn't take it personally and answered back. I'm not saying to be rude. What you need is to outright say what you do and don't want to people around you, even if it hurts their feelings. Or better yet, bring to light grievances you have had with people in the past and in a civil way, discuss them. Because that can start to ease the anger you have at the world rather than going the violent route, which will just make things worse in the long term. Izuku felt his mouth go dry at the thought. How many times had he wanted nothing more than to say exactly what he felt to all those people who wronged him? How many times did he thirst to just explain how shit those fuckers were? More than he can count, yet he knew too well that words have consequences. Fear showed in his eyes like he was a child again, about to be beaten down by whoever he displeased, yet he thought of Himiko and found the will to speak. But what if saying those things could get me physically attacked? What if they burn the few bridges I have? There aren't many people in my life and I'm not strong enough to overpower most of them if things turn sour. The doctor set her pen aside almost casually. Do it anyway. You're already on a teetering point and you're self-sufficient enough to not be in need of them. It's either that or you getting mad and madder until you snap. Blood drained from Izuku's face as he swallowed the advice and found it to be what he needed to hear. Standing up, he bowed to the woman. Thank you, Dr. Nagsha, you've given me a lot to consider. I have things to do. She nodded and handed him a business card. Anytime, also don't be afraid to schedule an appointment whenever. The commission foots the bill for anyone in the industry, so my door is always open. Taking the card, Izuku pocketed it and left out to the waiting room as sweat gathered under his shirt. Shoto was still where he was, scrolling on his phone before looking up at the approaching sidekick. So how'd it go? Calming himself, Izuku looked towards the exit and spoke flatly. It seems I need to have a conversation with Katsuki. Then Izuku continued to walk forward and left to go deal with a problem he should have dealt with long ago. Katsuki couldn't quite recall when he was this happy in a long time. For the past week he had been feeling conflicted ever since he had that talk with Deku. It had been the one time he had managed the courage to speak his damn mind and rally the others since the war, yet the day after all of them either laughed it off or legitimately forgot about that night. They had decided to let that sadistic monster breathe another day and left him alone with the responsibility like the weaklings they were. The only person he could turn to, hell the only reason he had the confidence to try and antagonize that bitch when she could slither into each of their homes and kill them, was Deku. Deku always had a plan, he always could figure shit out, and Katsuki knew that if he was set to pin the bitch down and enter, Deku might be the only one who could do it. And yet when he came to ask for help, the guy talked about things he never considered. He spelled out exactly what would happen if they did go through with the idea, and for some reason it made sense. Yet even still it bothered him. Here was a villain, a real one with no morals or humanity that nobody would mourn. A perfect target for a hero to take down and be praised for it that they could focus on, and the guy said no. He said no to helping Kaken bring down an actual bad guy and decided to just keep being Deku. This could have been a chance for them to reconnect, to come together as old friends and prevent evil. It might have even been what let them start being in each other's lives again in earnest. They could have bonded over the mission and things would be like it was when things were good. All it would need was that bitch being dead. Still, that didn't matter all that much since he had gotten a call from Deku asking to hang out. Sure, it was out of the blue and he sounded a little shook up, but they were hanging out again, at his house no less. How many times had he hoped for that? He invested so much money that they could have the fun they never had as kids, and now it was coming true. Suddenly it was like he was a kid again, eagerly awaiting his friend to show up. He even wore an old All Might muscle shirt he grabbed from some shop years ago. Time crawled by with him waiting by the door, but eventually there came a knock and the cameras showed exactly who was expected. Grinning like it was a happier time, Katsuki unlocked the door and opened it to come face to face with his oldest friend. Hey Deku, what's new with you? There wasn't the happy explosion of glee that he expected, but given how older they both were now it was understandable. However, Katsuki didn't expect such sullen apprehension and fear. Not only that, but there was also guilt in his green eyes that grew as he stepped forward without a word and stood in the living room. The two stood for a moment before Deku turned around with an expression that was as if he had a knife to his throat. So many emotions swirled behind his eyes, but while Katsuki shut the door the man finally spoke. Kaken, I'm sorry to bother you out of nowhere like this, but recently I've been to therapy and I need to talk to you about a few things, and make a few confessions. Katsuki raised an eyebrow at his friend, not exactly sure what to make of what was going on. About what exactly? Izuku nearly flinched at his words, as he raised his hands up and clenched and relaxed his fingers to ease the obvious tension he had. His voice was uneven and finicky, but he managed to look the hero in the eye despite the wall Katsuki could see in them. About. He paused and inhaled, seeming to let go of the tension inside him and relax somewhat. The tone of his voice was genuine and firm, matching the blonde tit for tat as his posture slimmed. Before I start this, Kaken, you need to understand that before you came back into my life I had a very different idea about who you were. I was wrong and I don't feel exactly that way anymore. I consider you to be something close to a friend despite all the shit I have, and I care about you. Otherwise Katsuki glared sharply at him like he had been personally insulted. Is this a fucking intervention? Have I done something over the line recently that I didn't notice? Izuku pursed his lips and breathed in spite of the reaction thrown his way. No Kaken, the problem isn't you, it's me. I need to talk to you and say what I need to, or the glare grew worse and the hero stepped forward, not exactly overcrowding the sidekick, but still making the room even more uncomfortable. What the hell would you even need to say to me? I get I haven't always been the best moralist, but what exactly is so important that you feel the need to start this bullshit right off the bat when it's the first time we've hung out in years? If you need help then Izuku couldn't keep whatever was in his head and leaned back as the words came loose like a gunshot. Because if I don't, then I think I might kill you or somebody else. The air grew still and heavy as the two looked at each other, one with abject horror and the other in blatant shame. It continued like that for what felt like eternity before the pen dropped and Katsuki broke the silence. "Who's threatening you?" he said with all the conviction of a fanatic, his hands reaching out for his friend only to have Izuku step back. "No one is threatening me. I have a lot of resentment towards you. But it's not just you, hell, you've barely been on that big of a bother, it's fucking everything." Izuku sighed and ran his hands over his face as the feelings of fear, shame, guilt and worse filled him. "Look, I just need to talk and for you to listen. Can you do that for me without blowing up?" Katsuki stared at him like he witnessed a stabbing, but retracted his hands and breathed. "Of course, say what you need to." The quirkless man managed something akin to a genuine smile for a moment and began to unravel the things in his head. "For the longest time, I've been angry at the world. Maybe not to the point of acting like Tom, the hand guy, but to the point where I really considered just snapping and acting out the more violent fantasies all that fury brought. And ever since high school, I used the idea of you as a focal point to lay all my blame at. Which only grew worse for a couple years as people stopped noticing me, and eventually it got to the point where He halted, shut his eyes and forced the rest out. Attempted to take my own life, twice. Nothing happened for a time, as if the whole house had held its breath. Yet to Izuku's surprise there wasn't an explosive outburst of anger or insults or even a punch thrown. Instead Katsuki continued to stare at him in silence, only the man's expression held a mad desperation that was alarming in the extreme. His breathing was slow and struggling, as if he was actively keeping himself together while his eyes held a certain emotion that made Izuku's neck hair stand up. Was it because I wasn't around? The quirkless man held the idea and found himself suddenly tired yet horrified. Like his old pains came back in force, but he was so over them that his mind could be bothered to care. In a manner of speaking, except it was more complicated than that. Katsuki fumbled with his emotions, looking somewhere between wanting to scream and numbingly calm while being plagued with a guilt of his very own. He gestured to his chest in a razor-thin voice that added to the growing tension between them. "I understand that and you have every right to be pissed off at me for all those years, but I'm here now. We can make everything better again." He managed a pathetically weak smile and it was then Izuku's patience finally, after a lifetime of repression, snapped. "Fuck you." Katsuki blinked, not sure he heard what he did. Bewilderment flowered upon his face as he stared back completely blown away, the thin measure of control he had clearly close to snapping itself. "What?" Izuku glared at the man with all the ire and hatred a lifetime of abandonment and abuse brings. However, he didn't lunge for him, he didn't pull the knife from his pocket. Instead he stood firm and spoke his mind even if it was going to kill him. "Fuck you for thinking you can just waltz back into my life whenever it's convenient. Motherfucker, I had to endure a life of loneliness, pain and nihilism because you decided your ego was too fucking fragile and then you walked out of my life with not even a single look back." He raised a finger and bared his teeth as more venom flowed in a vaguely controlled manner. "For most of my fucking life I followed you around because I considered you to be a friend, even you burned me with your hands, because I had no one else. I did everything for you and all it fucking earned me was pain. You caused me so much suffering that it ruined my childhood, and do you remember what happened during the last day of 7th grade, the last time I spoke to your ass in over a decade?" The glare got harsher and his tone drowned in throat-burning fury behind clenched teeth. "I walked up to wish you a happy summer and you just turned to me and spat on my shoe. Not a fucking word said, like I was worth less than shit." He stepped forward with a rapid thumping in his chest and the skin along his face turning a deeper red as his words went from a controlled tone to a full-on yell. "You took what little shit I had and got to live my fucking dream. Then when you're all the alone after being such an insufferable ass to everyone around you, only then do you decide I'm worth your fucking time. Motherfucker, I have had nothing to look forward to for 15 years because of you, and the only fucking reason I'm not fucking dead is because I met someone who fucking gets it. Who understands what it's like to have everyone consider you a disease just for being born the way you were." Izuku snarled and kept the valve open as more of his fury came out from his repression. "If it wasn't for her coming to help me through it all, I'd either be dead or in prison for first-degree murder, and that crazy-ass bitch has helped me infinitely more than you or almost anyone else ever fucking has. Yet you act like nothing ever fucking happened despite all the pain you put me through when all I wanted was to be a friend. You fucking burned me just for existing, because you could fucking do it. And yeah, I know she's fucking nuts and had done far worse things in the past, but compared to how you treated me, she's actually someone I can cherish. Someone who accepts me for who I am instead of using me as a kicking dog." The room grew twice as tense while Izuku stood with a panting breath and angry, like ice. Everything was still until at last Katsuki's shock faded. Confusion and laced-back horror transformed into anger and fury as his palms began to spark loudly with a furious fire in his eyes and his voice grating into that erupting booming of rage. "Where the fuck do you get off thinking you have any right to say any of that to me? After all I did, all I suffered and sacrificed to keep this world running while you got to stay on the fucking sidelines. Motherfucker, I was scared every day since I got into UA that a horde of monsters were going to kill me. I couldn't sleep, I could hardly relax, all I could do was sit around and hope they screwed up, and you're telling me you were wanting to kill me for keeping you away from it all." He snarled with the explosions getting louder. "Deku, those fucking monsters killed my dad right in front of me. They tried to kill my mom and they never left me alone, so the whole war was placed on my shoulders along with a few others worth a damn. I did all I did to protect you, to keep you out of their line of sight. That's why I never reached out." His teeth clanked and he jerked his head to the side, looking away from his friend as a much quieter tone took over. "I fucking wanted to, I always did. When I had to face that abomination at the USJ all those years ago, you were the first person I thought to call, but I couldn't without putting you at risk. So I was left to face that horrible shit without you." Izuku took in the words and found his own temper slowing to a far more cooled feeling. Still he glared, but somehow feeling more like the disgruntled youth he used to be rather than the near-murderous adult he is. Oddly, the fear at hearing and seeing what traumatized him was weakened, and he remained strong as his mind pictured Himiko standing right beside him. "I know, and that's why I don't hate you. I took a lot of my frustration and laid it at your feet, and I understand you aren't having the best time in life, but that doesn't change the past. I know it'd be right of me to overlook that mostly petty bullshit and help you, but I need to speak, I need to let it out before I snap." A reluctant sigh took over as he studied the man who nearly drove him to end it, his glare easing up as guilt took over. "That being said, I'm sorry I wasn't there for your father's funeral. I didn't know until recently, and my mom never said anything while we were in school. I know that if something like that happened to me even back then, you'd at least try." Katsuki looked back at the man who helped him through the hardest times in his life and sighed in return, suddenly feeling drained of energy. "It wasn't your fault, Deku. I was in a dangerous time, so UA decided not to have me or the old Hug reach out. If anything, it was that fucking gang of degenerates who to blame." They stood in silence a bit more, with the blonde chewing his lip as he mustered the will to do anything before he shook his head. "Look, I know I haven't always been the best when it came to being a friend, but I tried to help in my own way. You." He glared with scorn at the ceiling and forced the words out. "You were all I had. Sure, I had those other extras who kissed my ass, but I knew you were the only one who actually liked me for me. On top of that, you helped when my mom went nuts or I needed someone to talk to. So I was fucking scared of what would happen if you tried to be a hero, but all that other shit I did it to make you stronger." Katsuki turned his hands and stared at his palms, suddenly lost in his own thoughts. "All my life I saw Auntie coddling you, and I saw how that made you soft. You cried at fucking everything and never stood up for yourself once. I hated that, because I knew it only got worse for you unless something changed. And my mother's a lot of things, but she raised me to be strong and beat the weakness out of me. She said as much herself. So I figured the best I could do for you was to put that pressure on you like she did for me. Sure, I had an ego and maybe went too far, but you had Auntie to help keep you centered like my dad did for me after my mom whooped me." Izuku listened and felt the fury reignite in a very refined way as he balled his fists and glared. "But did you like your mother for that?" Katsuki shook his head, still stuck somewhere else. "No, but I knew it was necessary. It was like physical training. It sucked in the moment, but the discipline and results that came from it were invaluable. That's what you do for family, because the weak get weeded out and destroyed." The quirkless sidekick opened his mouth to speak, but couldn't as he saw the very fucked logic behind the statement. Again they remained stagnant and silent for a time before Izuku asked a question that honestly scared him. "Have you ever seriously considered killing your mother?" Katsuki nodded with his palms growing moist from sweat, his voice distant. "Every night growing up. She'd hit me or yell at me to stop being a pussy and man up. So eventually when my quirk came in full after puberty, I'd have to hold back from just blasting her apart when she freaked out. But the worst was when she did it to my dad, because he was close to quirkless himself and this bitch had him by the balls, just smacking the hell out of him or berating him like a maniac. Fuck, she'd smash wine bottles over his head and demand they fuck or spend time together, or she'd complain about him not spending enough time with her before she locked him inside their bedroom. He continued with a very faraway voice, seeming not to be there anymore. It was always Dad who kept things together when time got rough with her. He was the only one who she'd remotely listen to and shield me from her anger. Fuck, it was him who bought me most of the All Might stuff I had growing up. I can't remember all the times he scooped me up when my mom was in one of her rages and drove me somewhere away from that. We'd get ice cream or see a movie or something and I always asked him why we can't leave that place, and he always said, without fail, your mother may have issues, but she loves us and she's still our family, so we stay. Because if something happened to us, she'd stay even when she wanted to leave. You don't ever abandon family, Katsuki, because they're all you have in this world. That's why He shut his eyes as if he was in physical pain. That's why I pushed you away, because I knew you couldn't follow me and I didn't want you to be soft and needy for the first person who'd take advantage of you. I know I was an asshole, but I had to be for your sake, and once the League targeted me I couldn't reach out without hurting you. But, I guess with all that shit you would feel resentful. Air passed by his teeth and he had a resigned feel about himself as he shifted his now opened eyes to the sofa on his left. That's all I ever do. I guess that I'm too much like my mom, but hey, I made my dream come true. Yet everybody else either hates my guts or pities me or wants to use me, and with my dad gone, round face going her own way and shitty hair hiding in the States, you're all I have left. He inhaled and took a moment before meeting Izuku's eyes. I'm assuming there's grounds to salvage this, or I'm blowing shit out of proportion already and it isn't as drastic as I think. Otherwise you'd have just tried to beat my ass or worse when I opened that door, so what can we do? Do we even need to do anything, or did you just need to vent? Izuku paused for a moment, finding himself feeling a little better yet still somehow scared. I don't know. I'm not actively mad at you, if anything you've been more of a boon rather than a hindrance. We've both changed and we still mutually care about each other. Honestly, I expected you to beat the shit out of me or lose your shit from me saying all this. So we're better than we were. Katsuki filled in the last bit. Needed to get it out so you can get beyond it? The green-haired man nodded. Yeah. But, can you promise me you'll call if you ever feel like going nuts? Katsuki nodded back in response. You have my word. Although, what exactly made you go to therapy? Because if you've been dealing with this shit for that long, it wouldn't be any of the usual chaos that made you go. Is something going on? Izuku darted his vision to the side, suddenly filled with more trepidation than even Katsuki was. Sweat began to form and a wild fear and disgust showed before he breathed and stared at the explosion user with an expression he didn't like. Kaken, when you were taken by the League in your teens, did you ever genuinely consider it? Within seconds the relaxed spirit of the hero morphed into one of concerned bafflement, his eyes staring at the quirkless man like he was a stranger. Deku, what's going on? Be fucking honest with me, you can't joke around about shit like that. Izuku recoiled slightly but answered. I'm not joking. Hadn't you ever considered joining the side that lets you do anything, be anything? You could have had access to the one person able to bend reality at a whim and maybe change the world for the fucking better instead of being a government puppet. You could have been more. You could have been the one to usher in a new age instead of continuing this rotting one. You could have even been a ruler, but instead you chose to remain a servant. Katsuki blinked like he was blinded and hardened his gaze at the man. Those people were nothing but murderers, sadists, and con artists who would have stabbed me and anyone else in the back. I made my choice because it was better to die for my morals and ideals than live in a way filled with shame. Suddenly Izuku felt a fire light his belly and his voice began to take on a slight fanatical tint. But to them they were fighting for the same thing, to them they were the freedom fighters. Yes, they were monsters, but they were monsters who very nearly took over the world and shaped it however they wanted. You say it's better to not live in shame, but what's more shameful than living a boring life filled with anonymity when you could have taken a role in humanity's development? What if everything would have been better if you had taken their offer? The hero approached slowly with a silent revulsion behind his hardened eyes as he studied the sidekick. Are you saying you would have? Is that it? Izuku curled his fingers while excitement about the possibilities filled him. I don't know. I know the methods were wrong and the goals stupid, but the hand guy. Katsuki, he could have changed the world, and you have a chance to be directly in the ear of a person who was the closest thing we had to a god. You could have done anything if you just accepted and helped them win the war. We could be in space right now or have technology that we could only dream about. A sigh came from the explosion user as his harshness faded and a far more depressed aura emerged. Deku, that bastard, would have enslaved everyone just like his teacher would. They weren't any better even if he had a shitty backstory. The green-haired man felt a jolt go through him as he became more energetic. But how do you know that? He acted that way because of his teacher, and he only had the people around him afterwards. So maybe you could have convinced him to forego Earth entirely and go into space or colonize Mars or something other than waging a shitty war. Katsuki stared at him in utter confusion before burying his disgruntledness. What's with all this talk about space all of a sudden? Izuku flickered his eyes around and pulled out his pocketbook, feeling as giddy as he did when he was young. I think that if things went differently, he could have allowed for interstellar travel, or maybe I could have convinced him to give me the power somehow. It's just, the fact something like that quirk existed and had all that potential only to be wasted makes me wonder what could have been. Katsuki's ire grew, yet it was restrained well enough by pity. Deku, those people were insane, and if you think any of them would have given you anything but trouble, you're dead wrong. He continued to stare for a moment, taking in the general aura of his anchor. Is it because he could have given you a quirk? Shame showed on the green eat's face, but there were other, wilder emotions as his teeth crept through a near-manic smile. Yes, but it's more than that. Kaken, that quirk could have been the key to moving humanity forward, and it could have been free for the taking. Anyone could have had it if they convinced that hand guy to give it over, and I might have been able to do it. If I was in the right spot at the right time, I could have tricked him or convinced him. Hell, I could have cracked open his brain and eaten his pineal gland straight out of his brain after popping him in the chest with a quirk-cancelling bullet. A concerned disgust came upon the hero as he saw the expression of his friend. You're really starting to worry me. That guy might have been worse than anything, but to talk about actually eating a part of his brain, it's sick. Anger flared in Izuku's eyes, causing him to step forward with a certain madness overtaking him. It's power, Kaken, power to shape the stars, and if you hadn't blown him the fuck up, we might still have it. Fuck, even if we had a piece of his body with enough DNA, I could eventually clone him somehow, like we do the girl who makes the rewind shots, and transfer the quirk over to myself. If I have to eat the damn thing or wire some electric currents to its limbs and brain to make it work, I could have that power and use it for good. To be more than a stupid little man. Don't you understand that? An emotion blurred once Katsuki took stock of the situation, falling back on the things that kept him centered. He was blunt and to the point, like he needed to be. Nothing comes without a price. You think it would have been the greatest thing ever, but look at me. I achieved the dream we had, and it wasn't anything like I thought it would be. More mania took hold of the quirkless man, making him grin madly like one set by the grips of fervor. But that's because you weren't who you wanted to be. You're a decent enough hero in your own right, but you're not All Might, nobody could be. But I'm not Shigaraki, I'm not trying to imitate anyone. All I want is to have the power that was squandered. Then I could have changed everything for the better and been more than just a quirkless nobody. Katsuki swallowed his discomfort at the sight of such an affliction coming over his oldest friend. The mere mention of such things made him queasy, worse yet was the detail and forethought put into them. His eyes nearly trailed to the upward stairs at the far end of the living that led to his bedroom as a certain anxiety silently crawled under his skin. In a way, this obsession was understandable. One being born so powerless learns about the only quirk that could be transferred to anyone or taken by anyone, which was also the most powerful one. That's a recipe for the worst kind of desire. Yet it was the gleam in those green eyes, one so overtaken by greed and fantasy that were powered by one of the most obsessive and intelligent minds, which brought a sensation of dread to his belly. Perhaps Deku could have done what he claims, perhaps he could have stolen the quirk or convinced the monster to give it to him, but it was then Katsuki reminded himself that the bastard was dead and gone. Which meant that the demon's curse died with him. Besides, how would someone like Deku even find the equipment to replicate a clone? No, it was just maladaptive fantasy, and that was all. It doesn't matter. That bastard's been for a longest time and the curse with him, so there's no point thinking about it. You'd be better off thinking about your future or anything else other than an old faded ghost. The maddening light dimmed in Izuku's soul, but instead of simple dejection like the hero had expected, it was replaced with a thick resentment and fury that was equal in strength to the hopeful, demented glee. But that doesn't mean we can't move forward. Society can still grow even if that fool is dead, it's just everyone is so damn blind to what they can do. There's a bit of biological matter that can literally turn back time for a human body, and it's produced on a mass scale by the government through cloning. Why can't we do other shit that could lift us off this world? Why does everything stay the damn same even when the average person can change it? The notepad in his hands bent slightly in his fist, the sound making the fanatic stop his rant and stare at the warped cover. There was a quality to his face now, one of deep contemplation and unfolding ideas, as he pocketed his journal and regained the composure he had for all his life. Looking back at the man who tormented him, Izuku took on a plastic smile, content to be left alone, although the expression wasn't without a grain of sincerity. I apologize, Kaken. I have a new goal and I let that get away from myself. Thank you for being willing to humor my outburst, now I have to leave. Lots of things to think about and all that. He began to attempt to move past the man, only for Katsuki to place a hand directly on his chest. They gauged each other carefully, with the number one staring at the facade put on show for him and the scorned one gazing at the raw emotion directed towards him. Deku, you're worrying me here, dude. I don't think your head is screwed on right. Izuku nearly laughed at the sentiment, but felt oddly pleased at the clarity before him. Gently he moved the hand from his chest, taking a moment to allow some warmth towards the hero to seep out. You'd be right in that assumption. However, I simply have an idea to chase, and after all, most innovators are seen as a little touched in the head. Now I'm glad we've patched this whole ugly issue behind us, but would you let me say one thing to you? Katsuki's spine suddenly went rigid and sweat gathered under his skin when the air began to slightly cool. Izuku smiled at him like they were old friends again, but there was something about him that made the heart drum with constricted flurries of panic. It was like staring at a tide which held monstrosities below the calm reflection presented. Instinctively he knew that the man in front of him was dangerous, dangerous in the way a person with nothing left to lose or an animal defending what they have is. His eyes were cold, calculating, and fraught with a restrained violence that death meant nothing to, be that of himself or others. Yet there was also familiarity which lessened the potential waiting to be unleashed by a margin. One that spoke of a desired reluctance but could be overturned at will for the sake of whatever it was raised in defense of. The voice was like a knife placed against skin. Heavy, sharp, and beheld a pressure upon the body that could so easily spill blood if moved to take action. And for that reason he listened more now than ever before in his life. Kaken, I care about you, which is why I went through all this in the first place, and I'm more than willing to be there for you when you need me. But if you ever hurt the woman I love, if you go after her in some misbegotten quest to cleanse the world, I won't be so kind. His arms wrapped around him, taking the blonde in whole, and embraced him for a few heartbeats before patting him on the back. Letting go, Izuku grinned and spoke as he made his way out of the house. Be seeing you. With a clasp of the door, Katsuki was alone in his house once more, not sure what to make of that whole encounter. His heart raced and his mind swam as concern and fear and conspiracy blended and morphed. In one aspect he was scared of what he had heard, of how much that evil power seduced his friend if he hadn't put the monster down years ago. In another he was relieved that there was still much of that old kinship that he clung to. Granted, it wasn't as utterly exact as he would have liked, but with all the time and trauma life doled out to the man, what else could realistically be expected? Then there was that lingering tingle of terror at what could have been. His ancient curses at what would happen if that thin membrane which protected his old life was pierced by those monsters. But Katsuki wasn't as held in fear by it as much. Deku was a lot of things, but he wasn't evil, so there wouldn't be anything like what those bastards did. And yet he felt a tightening in his gut at the face of that bitch in his mind. She could have manipulated him and twisted his nobility into something far worse. She could even be the woman Deku threatened him over. Katsuki paused at the thought. Izuku was a lot of things, but he was smart enough to see a demon like her for what she is, much less if they'd been in contact for over a year. No, he's likely involved with some freak that got him all messed up instead of an actual murderer. Nobody could actually love an abomination like that, much less be willing to do so much for her. Yeah, Deku is just with some kinky bitch and is going through the motions. If he needed to air some grievances between them for the sake of their friendship, then that's fine. At least he had the decency to finally be honest instead of running away like shitty hair did to all of them. Everything would be okay now. Deku was still his friend even if he had a reason to be pissed, and that meant he wasn't alone. All he needed to do was behave better, and then things could go back to those better days, at least as close as they could be. Thanks for watching through till the end. You're incredible. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next part, and comment your ideas on what you want to see next. Also, let me know what pairings you like, if you want me to find some more LGBT-focused stories and couples. Thank you and have a great day.